Ah, Canada's court system. How wonderful and ambient its glow is. Actually, it's not really wonderful. If you're in court, that's not a very good thing. I'll explain why. If you're in court, chances are you've been pulled into court. And if you haven't been pulled into court, you are the plaintiff or the applicant in a matter. And you have entered into one of various points on this chart here. So I have circled here the military courts. Now, that is only one entry point for your entry into the court system. There are other entry points. They are all circled here. You don't enter this system 99% of the time unless you've entered into one of these other entry points. The only other way to enter the system not at these entry points is if you're doing it at, say, for instance, the Court of Appeal level. And at the Court of Appeal level, you'd be considered to be an intervener. That's the only other way that you can enter this system. And so let's focus on essentially how would you get to the Supreme Court? Well, if you don't get a favorable decision at one of these entry points, you can ask a higher court or the court above that court on this chain here. You would ask a higher court. So, for instance, if you didn't get a favorable decision here at the military court, so if you were charged under some kind of a military act, some kind of National Defense Act or whatever, you're going to now appeal to the Court-Martial Appeal Court. And if that is giving you a decision that you don't enjoy or you think is unjust, you can appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. And if the Supreme Court of Canada rules on your case, that is those principles are applicable and trickle down now to the rest of the courts in Canada. So that's how you hear in the media all the time, that there's a landmark case. That's what they mean by landmark case, where it's a principle that has been ruled on by the Supreme Court affects all of Canada. It's good to note that the Supreme Court only hears or accepts cases that are of national importance most of the time. I say most of the time because they are a body that can do whatever it is that they want to do. They make up their own rules and they, establish these rules for accepting cases, and they judge every case that comes before it before they even judge it. And I know that doesn't make much sense, but essentially, if you go to the Supreme Court, you don't just have a free and open door to go into the Supreme Court to have your case spoken to. You have to ask for permission before. Every single case that goes before the Supreme Court has to have specific permission in writing to allow it to move on to be heard by the full sitting of a complement of judges that will hear a Supreme Court case and that will make these landmark rulings. Essentially, those are ruled on by, I think it's 7 judges, and just to get in the door, that permission stage, I believe there are 3 judges that sit on, just taking the applications for permission to move forward. I think in some circumstances there's 5 judges that hear those applications. But essentially, that permission is called leave, or asking for leave to appeal. And that happens at Court of Appeal levels, and specifically at the Supreme Court of Canada, all the time. If you're at a court of appeal in your province, and in some cases, you won't need leave to appeal. A right of appeal is automatic. But in some circumstances at the provincial level, you will need leave to appeal. And I'm not going to cover that in this video, but essentially you should know when that is. If you're in a specific court, you should know how your appeals will go up the chain all the way to the Supreme Court. You should know that. Now, going back here to the bottom of the system or the chain of the court system, we have to the right of the military courts, we have the provincial administrative tribunals. So what we used to refer to these in school are as the ABCs of tribunals. So think of this as agencies, boards, and commissions. And also what fits into that little circle there are provincial courts. So, or municipal courts. For instance, if you're getting a ticket at the provincial level, it will be dealt with in this court first. And at the provincial level, that's talking about traffic acts. And if you're getting a traffic ticket, all of that is dealt with at this level here. And then if you were to appeal, you're going to appeal to a provincial court, and that also falls at the same level as the superior courts, and that would be the Ontario Court of Justice or the Superior Court of Justice in Ontario. In Alberta, that would be called the Queen's Bench. And, there are various names for these types of levels of court across Canada. Queen's Bench is a superior court, and the Supreme Court of BC is one of those courts. One court that is below that would be the Provincial Court. And the Provincial Court, the Provincial Court of BC or the Provincial Court of Alberta, for instance, are hearing matters, criminal matters. They're hearing appeals from traffic matters. They are hearing some family matters, some child protection matters, and then they're hearing some other types of family cases. What they're not hearing are family cases that deal with division of property and divorces, and so that's dealt with at the superior court level. So if you're in family court and you're dealing with a divorce or a division of property, you're most likely going to enter the system at the superior court level. To the right, we have federal administrative tribunals. So this would be the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, not the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. There is the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and that deals with issues of federal bodies. So they don't have they don't intertwine that system there, and that's for a specific reason. It's also good to note that if you're entering the court system, say for instance at the provincial court level, right above administrative tribunals, if you're entering there at the Ontario Court of Justice level, for instance, in Ontario, then your step up or your appeal is to a superior court. And that's usually within the same city, although sometimes it can be in different districts. So what happens if you climb your appeal and at one level it stops? Well, if it stops, say for instance at the superior court level, and that court makes a decision that may affect courts below it, only in that province, that is considered binding on the courts that are below it. So if the provincial superior court makes a decision on your case, that case now, or the principles of that case, are now affecting, if there are similar cases, are affecting provincial courts, provincial territorial courts below it, or provincial administrative tribunals below it, if of course those are applicable, if the circumstances are similar. So, if your case makes it all the way to the Court of Appeal, and it doesn't go to the Supreme Court, if the Court of Appeal in that province rules on your case, the principles now trickle down to every other court and tribunal below it. Now, that is what's called a hierarchy of the system. So, a higher court makes a decision, and it's now binding on the rest of the courts only in that province. Keep that in mind. If it's not binding on, if a case is not binding on another court in another territory, for instance. So, for instance, if the Court of Appeal of Ontario, the Court of Appeal for Ontario, makes a decision, that is not binding on the Court of Appeal in British Columbia, and vice versa. So, if a Court of Appeal of British Columbia makes a decision, though, and you go to the Court of Appeal for Ontario, if you have a case in hand that is similar in nature to yours from, say, for instance, the Court of Appeal of British Columbia, that is very persuasive to a court in Ontario, but it's not binding. The Court of Appeal of Ontario does not have to follow in those footsteps from that order of British Columbia. The Court of Appeal of Ontario has only one source of case law that is binding on the Court of Appeal of Ontario, and that's from the Supreme Court of Canada. So understand that principle, and when you start to look at case law or cases, you'll now understand what principles now are binding on all of Canadians. You'll now understand what principles can be binding now on just at the provincial level. So if you have questions, please feel free to comment below or send us an email on our website, irepmyself.com, and thanks for watching.